I never thought I'd be the type of person to get completely destroyed by a coworker. But there I was, standing in front of my entire office while they accused me of sabotaging our biggest client project. My hands were literally shaking, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me like I was some kind of criminal. Ryan had used my password to access our system over the weekend, and when everything crashed and burned, guess who got blamed? Me. The way he stood there, looking all concerned and supportive, while he fed them lies about what really happened. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone what he'd actually done, but who was going to believe me? I felt like such an idiot for trusting him, for giving him access to my accounts because I thought we were partners, because I thought he had my back. That moment when my manager David looked at me with such disappointment, like I'd personally betrayed him, it broke something inside me that I didn't know could break. But what happened next? What I discovered about myself when I was pushed to my absolute limit? That's a story I need to tell you. I still remember that Tuesday morning when everything started. The coffee machine in our small office was making that familiar gurgling sound, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did. Ryan walked over to my desk with that easy smile of his, the one that made everyone in the office feel like they were part of something bigger. His sleeves were rolled up, and he had that determined look that usually meant we were about to tackle something important together. I trusted him completely back then, the way you trust someone who's had your back through countless late nights and impossible deadlines. There was this unspoken understanding between us, a professional loyalty that felt as solid as the concrete foundation of our downtown office building. That trust, that confidence in our partnership, would soon become the very thing that would destroy me. The project we were working on was massive, the kind that could make or break careers in our small marketing firm. We had exactly 72 hours to deliver a comprehensive campaign proposal to our biggest client, a deal worth more than our entire office had seen in 2 years. Everyone was running on pure adrenaline and gas station coffee, but there was this electricity in the air, this shared sense that we were part of something special. Ryan and I had been the core team from day one, bouncing ideas off each other like we were reading from the same playbook. The way he listened to my suggestions, the way he built on my concepts, it all felt like genuine collaboration. I felt valued, heard, like my contributions actually mattered in this crazy world of corporate deadlines and bottom lines. Looking back now, I wonder if that feeling of being essential was just an illusion, a setup for what was coming. The pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced before, but it was the good kind of pressure. The kind that makes you feel alive and capable of achieving the impossible. We were all staying late, ordering pizza to the office, and turning our workspace into this war room of creativity and determination. Ryan would stop by my desk every few hours, checking in, making sure I had everything I needed to keep pushing forward. His dedication was infectious, and I found myself working harder than I ever had, fueled by this sense of mutual respect and shared ambition. The trust between us felt unbreakable, forged in the fire of impossible deadlines and shared victories. But even as we worked side by side, building something incredible together, there were forces at play that I couldn't see coming. The foundation of that trust was already beginning to crack, though I wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. That Wednesday afternoon, when the system started acting up and we needed to move fast, Ryan approached me with an urgency I'd never seen before. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by something more intense, more desperate, and he explained that we needed to streamline our workflow to meet the deadline. The logical solution, he said, was for him to have access to my system credentials, so he could upload files and make updates without having to wait for me to be available. It made perfect sense at the time, especially with the clock ticking and everyone scrambling to pull their weight. I handed over my password without a second thought, the same way you'd give your house key to a trusted friend. In that moment, I felt like we were true partners, two professionals working toward the same goal with complete transparency and mutual support. Little did I know that I was handing him the weapon he would use to destroy my reputation and my career. The rest of that week flew by in a blur of late nights, energy drinks, and the kind of focused intensity that only comes when everything is on the line. Ryan was in and out of the system constantly, uploading revisions, making last-minute changes, and coordinating with different team members to ensure everything was perfect. I felt proud watching him work with such dedication, using the access I'd given him to push our project forward. There was something beautiful about the way we functioned as a unit, each of us contributing our strengths to create something neither of us could have achieved alone. The trust I'd placed in him felt validated every time he updated me on his progress, every time he asked for my input on the changes he was making. I went home that Friday feeling like we'd accomplished something truly special, like our professional partnership had reached a new level of depth and effectiveness. The loyalty I felt toward Ryan was absolute, and I believed that feeling was mutual. But as I learned the hard way, trust in the workplace is a fragile thing, easily broken and impossible to repair once the damage is done. The access I'd given Ryan wasn't just about convenience or efficiency. It was about vulnerability, about placing my professional reputation in someone else's hands without fully understanding the implications. In my eagerness to be a team player, to contribute to our shared success, I'd opened a door that I would never be able to close again. The confidence I felt in our partnership was real, but it was built on assumptions about his character that would prove to be devastatingly wrong. That weekend, as I relaxed and celebrated what I thought was our mutual victory, the seeds of betrayal were already taking root. The environment of trust and collaboration that had felt so genuine was about to reveal itself as nothing more than an elaborate stage for deception and professional sabotage. Everything I thought I knew about loyalty, about professional relationships, about the bonds forged through shared struggle and mutual respect, was about to be shattered in ways I never could have imagined. The frustration and disappointment that were coming would cut deeper than any personal betrayal I'd ever experienced, because this wasn't just about broken trust between friends. This was about my livelihood, my reputation, my entire professional identity being placed in jeopardy by someone I'd considered an ally. The learning that would come from this experience would be harsh and unforgiving, but it would also be essential, teaching me lessons about human nature and workplace dynamics that no business school could ever provide. As I sat there that Sunday evening, reviewing our completed project with a sense of pride and accomplishment, I had no idea that my world was about to collapse in ways that would test every ounce of strength and resilience I possessed. Monday morning hit like a freight train, and I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the office. The usual buzz of productivity was replaced by this heavy silence, the kind that settles over a workplace when disaster strikes without warning. Janet from IT was hunched over her computer, her face pale and drawn, while our manager David paced behind her with the kind of controlled panic that made my stomach drop. The coffee in my hand suddenly felt too hot, and I could feel sweat forming on my palms. Despite the aggressive air conditioning that always made our office feel like an icebox, Ryan was already at his desk, but something about his posture seemed different, more rigid, like he was bracing himself for impact. I set my bag down slowly, that familiar sense of dread creeping up my spine, as I realized that whatever had happened over the weekend was about to change everything. The trust and confidence from Friday's celebration felt like a distant memory, replaced by this suffocating atmosphere of crisis and impending doom. The system failure had apparently started sometime Sunday night, a cascading series of errors that had corrupted critical client data and compromised months of work across multiple projects. Janet's explanation came in fragments, technical jargon mixed with barely contained frustration as she tried to piece together what had gone wrong. Our main database had crashed, taking with it not just our current project but backup files, client communications, and revenue projections that represented the financial backbone of our small firm. The magnitude of the disaster was becoming clearer with each passing minute, and I could see the color draining from David's face as he calculated the potential losses. This wasn't just a technical hiccup or a minor inconvenience. This was the kind of catastrophic failure that could destroy a business overnight. The professional environment that had felt so secure and collaborative just days before was now hanging by a thread, and everyone knew that heads were going to roll. The loyalty and teamwork that had carried us through the previous week's challenges seemed meaningless in the face of this digital apocalypse. As the investigation began, I felt this growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. Janet was pulling system logs, tracing user access records, and trying to identify the exact moment when things had gone wrong. Every click of her keyboard seemed to echo in the silence, and I found myself holding my breath as she worked her way through the data. The rest of the team gathered around like spectators at a car accident, unable to look away but dreading what they might see. Ryan stood slightly apart from the group, his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes, a distance that hadn't been there before, and I felt the first stirrings of doubt creeping into my mind. The frustration in the room was palpable, everyone desperate for answers but afraid of what those answers might reveal. I kept thinking about the access I'd given Ryan, the password that had seemed like such a small gesture of trust, and wondering if somehow that decision was connected to our current nightmare. The moment of truth came like a punch to the gut, swift and merciless in its clarity. Janet's voice cut through the tension as she announced that the critical system changes had been made using my login credentials, my digital fingerprints all over the disaster that had brought our company to its knees. The silence that followed was deafening, dozens of eyes turning toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to accusation. I felt like I was standing in quicksand, the ground beneath my feet dissolving as everyone processed what they'd just heard. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about a technical error anymore. This was about responsibility, about blame, about someone's career being destroyed in front of the entire office. The sense of betrayal was already beginning to form, though I didn't yet understand who had betrayed whom. All I knew was that my professional reputation was being shredded in real time, and I was powerless to stop it. Ryan's response came faster than I expected, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the room with the kind of confidence that made everyone listen. He acknowledged that he'd used my credentials over the weekend, explained that it had been necessary for the project deadlines, and expressed genuine concern about the system failure. But then came the words that would haunt me for months afterward, delivered with such conviction that even I almost believed them. He stated clearly that he had only accessed the files we'd discussed, that he had made no system-level changes, and that whatever had caused the disaster must have happened after his involvement ended. The way he said it, with just the right amount of professional concern mixed with personal disappointment, was masterful. He wasn't just denying responsibility, he was positioning himself as another victim of the mysterious system failure. The deception in his voice was so subtle, so carefully crafted, that I felt my own certainty beginning to waver. Everyone in that room wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was too complicated and uncomfortable to process. The investigation that followed felt like a slow-motion execution, each new piece of evidence tightening the noose around my professional neck. David called me into his office that afternoon, his usual warmth replaced by the cold efficiency of damage control. The disappointment in his eyes was worse than anger would have been, a look that said he'd expected better from someone he trusted and promoted. He explained that while the technical investigation was still ongoing, the preliminary evidence pointed to unauthorized system modifications made under my credentials. The client was demanding answers, threatening to pull their contract and pursue legal action for the lost data. Insurance companies were being contacted, lawyers were being consulted, and my name was at the center of it all. The learning curve I was experiencing was brutal and immediate, a crash course in how quickly trust could evaporate, and how thoroughly a reputation could be destroyed. As I sat there listening to David outline the potential consequences, I realized that my career as I knew it was already over, regardless of what the final investigation might reveal. The weight of false accusations settled over me like a suffocating blanket, heavy and inescapable. Walking back to my desk, I could feel the stares of my colleagues, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I passed by. The office that had felt like a second home just days before now felt hostile and alien, every familiar face now looking at me with suspicion and judgment. Ryan offered what seemed like sympathy, expressing his shock and disappointment about the situation. But there was something hollow in his words, something that didn't quite ring true. I wanted to confront him directly, to demand the truth about what he'd really done with my access. But the doubt was eating away at my confidence. What if I was wrong? What if the system failure really was just a coincidence, and I was looking for someone to blame because I couldn't accept responsibility for my own poor judgment? The superego that would eventually come from this experience still felt impossible, buried under layers of shame, anger, and professional devastation. That night, I went home to my empty apartment and sat in the dark, trying to process how quickly my world had turned upside down, how completely I'd been isolated and abandoned by people I'd considered allies. The next few days passed in a haze of professional isolation that felt like being buried alive. I'd wake up each morning with that split second of normalcy before reality crashed back down, reminding me that I was now the office pariah, the person everyone whispered about when they thought I wasn't listening. The betrayal wasn't just Ryan's anymore. It was systemic, woven into every interaction and every averted glance from colleagues who had once treated me as an equal. Walking into that office each day required a level of courage I didn't know I possessed, forcing myself to maintain dignity while my reputation crumbled around me like old concrete. Ryan continued to play his part perfectly, offering just enough concern and sympathy to maintain his image, while carefully distancing himself from any real accountability. The way he managed to look genuinely puzzled whenever the investigation came up was almost artistic in its deception. I found myself studying his face during meetings, searching for cracks in his performance, but he was too skilled, too practiced in the art of professional manipulation to give anything away. What hurt most wasn't the accusation itself, but the speed with which everyone accepted it as truth. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, people who had seen my dedication and integrity firsthand, yet they were willing to believe I was capable of sabotaging our entire operation. The confidence they'd once shown in my abilities evaporated overnight, replaced by this cautious distance that made every conversation feel stilted and uncomfortable. Lunch invitations stopped coming, casual conversations dried up, and I found myself eating alone in my car more often than not. The trust that had taken years to build was destroyed in a matter of days, and I was learning the hard lesson that professional relationships are often more fragile than we want to believe. Even Emma, who had been my closest ally in the office, started treating me with a politeness that felt worse than outright hostility. The disappointment in her eyes every time she looked at me was like a knife twisting in my chest, a constant reminder of how completely I'd been abandoned by people I'd considered friends. Ryan's performance during the extended investigation was nothing short of masterful, a clinic in how to deflect blame while appearing cooperative and concerned. He volunteered for additional interviews, offered to provide his personal devices for examination, and even suggested bringing in an external forensics team to ensure a thorough investigation. Every gesture was calculated to reinforce his image as someone with nothing to hide, someone genuinely invested in getting to the truth. When David asked him directly about the work he'd done using my credentials, Ryan's response was detailed and seemingly transparent, explaining exactly which files he'd accessed and which changes he'd made. He painted himself as someone who had simply been trying to help, who had used my access responsibly and with my full knowledge and consent. The way he described our collaboration made it sound like a model of professional teamwork, which made his denial of responsibility for the disaster even more convincing. I sat there listening to him lie with such conviction and skill that I almost started to doubt my own memory of events. The absence of concrete proof became my greatest enemy and his strongest ally. Digital forensics is a complex field, and the system logs that might have revealed the truth had been partially corrupted in the same disaster that had started this nightmare. What evidence remained was circumstantial at best, showing access patterns and file modifications, but not providing the clear timeline that would have established guilt or innocence beyond doubt. Ryan understood this better than anyone, and he used the ambiguity to his advantage. acknowledging what couldn't be denied while maintaining plausible deniability about everything else. He never directly accused me of lying, but his careful phrasing implied that perhaps I was confused about what had happened, or maybe suffering from stress-related memory issues. The frustration of knowing the truth but being unable to prove it was eating me alive, like trying to grab smoke with bare hands. Every day that passed without clear evidence was another day that his version of events became more accepted as reality. The isolation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A professional exile that seeped into every aspect of my daily life. Colleagues who had once sought my input on projects now routed requests through other team members, treating me like I was radioactive. Meeting invitations became sporadic, and when I was included, I could feel the tension in the room, the way conversations would shift when I entered. Even casual interactions became strained, with people offering forced smiles and making excuses to cut conversations short. The betrayal wasn't just Ryan's calculated deception. It was the collective abandonment by an entire workplace community that had once embraced me. I started arriving early and leaving late, not because I had more work to do, but because I wanted to avoid the awkward encounters in the hallway and the parking lot. The office that had once felt like a second home now felt like hostile territory. Every familiar face now looking at me with suspicion and judgment. Ryan's ability to maintain his facade while watching me suffer was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire betrayal. He would stop by my desk occasionally, always when others were watching, to offer words of support and encouragement. These public displays of concern served a dual purpose, reinforcing his image as a caring colleague while subtly emphasizing my isolated position. In private moments, though, I began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor, small signs that suggested he was enjoying my downfall more than he let on. There was a smugness hidden behind his expressions of sympathy, a satisfaction that he tried to conceal, but couldn't quite hide from someone who had once known him so well. The realization that he was taking pleasure in my professional destruction was like discovering that someone you trusted had been poisoning your food for months. The betrayal went beyond mere opportunism or self-preservation. It revealed a level of malice that I hadn't thought him capable of. The learning process was brutal but necessary, teaching me that some people are willing to destroy others, not just for personal gain, but for the simple satisfaction of wielding that kind of power. As the investigation dragged on without resolution, I found myself becoming a ghost in my own workplace, present but invisible, contributing but unacknowledged. The confidence I'd once felt in my abilities and judgment was shattered, replaced by a constant second-guessing that made every decision feel like walking through a minefield. I started documenting everything obsessively, keeping detailed records of every conversation and every task, not because it would help with the current situation, but because I was learning to protect myself in ways I'd never needed to before. The trust that had once been the foundation of my professional relationships was gone, replaced by a wariness that colored every interaction. I was discovering that betrayal doesn't just destroy what was, it changes what can be, leaving scars that affect how you approach every future relationship and opportunity. The person I'd been before this experience, naive and trusting and optimistic about human nature, was gone forever, replaced by someone harder and more suspicious, but also, perhaps, more resilient and prepared for the realities of professional life. The decision to fight back didn't come like a lightning bolt of inspiration. It emerged slowly from the depths of my frustration and anger, like a stubborn weed pushing through concrete. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at my bedroom ceiling, replaying every conversation, every moment, every detail of what had happened between Ryan and me. The betrayal had left me feeling powerless and victimized. But somewhere in that darkness, I found a spark of the person I used to be, the woman who had never backed down from a challenge or accepted defeat without a fight. I wasn't going to let him destroy my career without consequences. Wasn't going to let his lies become the official version of events that would follow me for the rest of my professional life. The learning curve ahead would be steep and painful, but I was ready to climb it. Ready to discover what I was truly capable of when pushed to my absolute limit. That Thursday morning, I walked into the office with a different energy. No longer the defeated victim, but someone with a purpose and a plan. The confidence that had been shattered was slowly rebuilding itself, not as naive trust, but as determined resolve. Documentation became my weapon of choice, and I approached it with the methodical precision of a detective building a case. I started by recreating a detailed timeline of everything that had happened in the weeks leading up to the disaster, noting every conversation with Ryan, every request for access, every decision that had led to my current situation. My home office became a war room, covered with printouts, sticky notes, and flowcharts that mapped out the sequence of events from multiple angles. I reached out to colleagues who had witnessed our interactions, carefully phrasing my questions to avoid seeming desperate or accusatory, while gathering information that might support my version of events. The process was exhausting and often demoralizing, especially when people who had once been friendly became evasive or uncomfortable when I brought up certain topics. But I persisted, driven by a determination that surprised even me, methodically building a case that would either clear my name or provide closure by proving definitively what had really happened. Every email I'd sent, every meeting I'd attended, every decision I'd made became a piece of evidence in my own defense. The hardest part wasn't gathering information. It was maintaining my composure while continuing to work alongside the person who had orchestrated my downfall. Ryan's presence in the office became a constant reminder of the injustice I was fighting against. His casual demeanor and easy smile serving as a daily insult to everything I'd lost. I had to resist the urge to confront him directly, to demand an explanation or confession that I knew would never come. Instead, I channeled that energy into my investigation, using my anger as fuel for the painstaking work of reconstructing the truth. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the weight of fighting alone against an entire system seemed impossible to bear. The disappointment of discovering how easily people had abandoned me was almost as painful as the original betrayal, but it also strengthened my resolve to prove them wrong. I wasn't going to let their lack of faith in me become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Wasn't going to validate their decision to write me off without a fight. The supercar I was experiencing wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about discovering who I really was when everything was stripped away. My meeting with David was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and I spent the entire week preparing for what felt like the most important presentation of my career. I organized my evidence into a clear, logical narrative that addressed every aspect of the case, from the technical details of what had happened to the timeline of events that proved my innocence. The night before the meeting, I rehearsed my presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly, anticipating every possible question or challenge that might arise. I knew I would only get one chance to make my case, and I was determined to make it count. Walking into that conference room, I felt like David facing Goliath, armed with nothing but truth and determination against a system that had already made up its mind. David's expression was neutral but not hostile, which I took as a positive sign, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the doubt that had been planted by weeks of accepting Ryan's version of events. The trust that had once existed between us was damaged, perhaps irreparably, but I was hoping that logic and evidence might bridge that gap. The presentation itself was both the most terrifying and most empowering experience of my professional life. I laid out my case methodically, walking David through each piece of evidence, each inconsistency in Ryan's story, each technical detail that pointed toward a different conclusion than the one everyone had accepted. I could see him processing the information, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine interest as the weight of my evidence became clear. The questions he asked were probing but fair, and I could tell that he was beginning to see the situation from a different perspective. When I finished, there was a long silence that felt like an eternity, followed by David's admission that my presentation had raised serious concerns about the official narrative. He couldn't promise immediate action, but he agreed to reopen the investigation with a focus on the specific issues I had raised. The confidence I felt walking out of that room was different from what I'd experienced before. Not the naive trust of someone who believed the system would naturally protect the innocent, that the hard-won assurance of someone who had fought for justice and refused to be silenced. The loyalty I'd once felt toward the company was gone, replaced by a loyalty to myself and to the truth that I'd worked so hard to uncover. The waiting period that followed was agony, each day bringing the possibility of vindication or the confirmation that my efforts had been in vain. Ryan seemed to sense that something had shifted, his casual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. Our interactions became even more strained, charged with an undercurrent of tension that everyone in the office could feel. I found myself watching him more carefully, noting the small signs of stress that began to appear as the investigation resumed with renewed intensity. The other colleagues who had distanced themselves from me seemed uncertain about how to react, caught between their earlier judgment and the growing possibility that they had been wrong. The environment in the office became increasingly uncomfortable for everyone, but I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that the truth was finally getting the attention it deserved. The learning process continued as I discovered my own capacity for patience and persistence, qualities I hadn't known I possessed, until I was forced to develop them under the most challenging circumstances possible. As the new investigation began to unfold, I realized that fighting for justice had changed me in fundamental ways that went far beyond clearing my name. The woman who had naively shared her password without a second thought was gone, replaced by someone who understood the importance of protecting herself and documenting everything. The trust I'd once placed in systems and institutions had been replaced by a healthy skepticism and a determination to verify everything independently. I'd learned that sometimes you have to be your own advocate, your own defender, your own source of confidence and strength when everyone else has given up on you. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had also revealed capabilities and resilience that I might never have discovered otherwise. The frustration and disappointment that had consumed me for weeks were being transformed into something more powerful and lasting, a sense of personal strength that no one could take away from me. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, I knew I would never again be the person who could be so easily victimized, so quickly abandoned, so thoroughly underestimated by those who thought they knew me. The call came on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:47, and I knew from David's tone that everything was about to change. He asked me to come to his office immediately, and there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard in weeks, a warmth that suggested the nightmare might finally be coming to an end. Walking down that familiar hallway felt different this time, my footsteps echoing with a confidence that had been absent for so long. The other employees I passed seemed to sense something was happening, their curious glances following me as I made my way to what felt like my moment of vindication. Janet from IT was already in David's office when I arrived, surrounded by printouts and technical reports that covered every surface of his usually pristine desk. The expression on her face was a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal embarrassment, the look of someone who had finally solved a puzzle, but wasn't entirely happy with the solution. David gestured for me to sit down, and I could feel my heart racing as he began to explain what their deeper investigation had uncovered. The betrayal was about to be exposed in all its calculated detail, and I found myself holding my breath as the truth finally began to emerge. The technical evidence was damning in its clarity, a digital trail that painted a picture of deliberate manipulation and systematic deception. Janet walked me through the recovered log files, pointing out timestamps and access patterns that told a story completely different from the one Ryan had been selling for weeks. The system modifications that had caused the disaster weren't random errors or accidental changes. They were deliberate alterations made to critical configuration files, changes that could only have been made by someone with deep technical knowledge and malicious intent. What made it even worse was the sophistication of the cover-up, the way Ryan had attempted to mask his digital footprints and create false evidence that would point suspicion toward me. He hadn't just betrayed my trust, he had actively worked to destroy my reputation and career, while positioning himself as an innocent bystander. The confidence I'd once had in his character seemed laughable now, replaced by a chilling understanding of just how calculating and ruthless he had been from the very beginning. Every gesture of support, Every expression of concern, every moment of apparent solidarity had been part of an elaborate performance designed to cover his tracks. David's explanation of the broader investigation revealed layers of deception that went far beyond what I had imagined. Ryan hadn't just sabotaged our current project. He had been systematically undermining the company's operations for months, stealing proprietary information and selling it to competitors, while maintaining his facade as a dedicated employee. The disaster that had nearly cost me my career was just the tip of the iceberg, a moment when his carefully constructed web of lies had finally started to unravel. The forensic accountants had traced financial irregularities back to his personal accounts, discovering a pattern of corporate espionage that had been going on under everyone's noses. The loyalty he had pretended to feel toward our company was completely fabricated, a mask worn by someone who had been actively working to destroy us from within. I felt sick thinking about all the times I had defended him, all the moments when I had questioned my own judgment instead of trusting my instincts about his behavior. The learning experience was brutal but necessary, teaching me that some people are capable of levels of deception that honest people struggle to even comprehend. The moment when David formally cleared me of all wrongdoing was both triumphant and hollow, a vindication that came too late to undo all the damage that had been done. The apology he offered was sincere, but couldn't erase the weeks of isolation and professional humiliation I had endured. I appreciated his admission that the company had failed me, that they should have conducted a more thorough investigation from the beginning, instead of accepting Ryan's lies at face value. But even as I felt the weight of false accusation lifting from my shoulders, I couldn't ignore the fact that my trust in the organization had been permanently damaged. The colleagues who had abandoned me so quickly, the system that had been so eager to scapegoat me, the environment that had made me feel like a pariah, none of that could be undone by a simple acknowledgement of error. The disappointment I felt wasn't just about Ryan's betrayal anymore. It was about discovering how fragile professional relationships really were, and how quickly people were willing to sacrifice loyalty for convenience. The supercar I was experiencing was bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that vindication had come at such a high personal cost. Ryan's downfall, when it finally came, was swift and decisive, but it brought me less satisfaction than I had expected. David called him into the office that same afternoon, confronting him with the evidence that had been uncovered, and giving him the opportunity to explain his actions. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I could see him through the glass walls of the conference room, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking as the weight of his crimes became undeniable. The confident facade that had protected him for so long crumbled in a matter of minutes, replaced by the desperate panic of someone whose web of lies had finally collapsed. Security escorted him from the building within the hour, and I watched from my desk as he gathered his personal belongings under the watchful eyes of company officials. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of personal triumph where I could look him in the eye and tell him what I thought of his betrayal. He avoided eye contact with everyone as he left, his shoulders hunched in defeat, looking more pathetic than dangerous. The frustration I had carried for so long began to dissolve, not because of any sense of revenge, but because justice had finally been served through proper channels. The aftermath brought a mixture of vindication and complicated emotions that I hadn't anticipated. Colleagues who had distanced themselves from me began reaching out with apologies and explanations, some genuine and others clearly motivated by self-preservation now that the truth was known. Emma was among the first to approach me, her eyes filled with tears as she expressed her regret for doubting me and her admiration for how I had handled the entire situation. These reconciliations were meaningful, but couldn't completely heal the wounds that had been opened by their initial abandonment. I found myself evaluating each relationship differently, understanding now that trust once broken could be rebuilt, but would never again be given unconditionally. The confidence I felt wasn't the same naive optimism I'd had before. It was something harder and more realistic, tempered by experience and loss. David offered me a promotion and a significant raise, both as compensation for what I'd endured and recognition of the strength I'd shown throughout the ordeal. The loyalty I'd once felt toward the company was slowly returning, but it was now conditional, based on mutual respect rather than blind faith. The lessons learned from this experience went far beyond workplace politics or the importance of protecting passwords and documenting everything. I had discovered capabilities within myself that I hadn't known existed, reserves of strength and determination that had carried me through the darkest period of my professional life. The woman who had been so easily manipulated and isolated was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't allow others to define her value based on their prejudices or convenience. The trust I placed in people would be more carefully considered from now on, but I refused to let Ryan's betrayal turn me into someone cynical or closed off from meaningful connections. The learning process had been painful but transformative, teaching me that resilience isn't about avoiding difficult situations, but about finding the strength to fight through them with dignity and purpose. As I sat at my desk that evening, looking out at the city lights and processing everything that had happened, I realized that while I couldn't change what had been done to me, I had complete control over who I chose to become because of it. The weeks that followed my vindication were a strange mixture of relief and reckoning, as I slowly came to understand that clearing my name was only the beginning of a much longer healing process. The confidence that had been shattered wasn't automatically restored by David's apology or the company's acknowledgement of their mistakes. It had to be rebuilt piece by piece, like reassembling a broken vase that would never look quite the same again. I found myself second-guessing decisions that would have been automatic before, questioning motives that I once would have accepted at face value, approaching every interaction with a level of caution that felt both necessary and exhausting. The trust that had once come naturally now required conscious effort, a deliberate choice rather than an instinctive response to professional relationships. Sleep didn't come easily in those first few weeks, my mind replaying not just Ryan's betrayal, but all the small moments when I should have seen the warning signs, should have protected myself better, should have been less naive about human nature. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving, teaching me that some lessons can only be absorbed through painful experience. That wisdom often comes at a price that seems too high, until you realize what you've gained. The most difficult aspect of moving forward wasn't dealing with the technical aftermath of the crisis, but navigating the changed dynamics with colleagues who had abandoned me so quickly when things looked bad. Emma's apologies felt genuine, but they couldn't erase the memory of eating lunch alone in my car while she shared meals with people who had written me off without a second thought. David's efforts to make amends were professional and appropriate, but they highlighted how easily the system had been willing to sacrifice me for the sake of convenience and appearances. I appreciated their attempts at reconciliation, but I also recognized that these relationships would never return to their previous state of easy camaraderie and mutual trust. The betrayal hadn't just been Ryan's. It had been collective, a failure of the entire workplace community to show loyalty when it mattered most. The disappointment I felt wasn't bitter or vengeful, but it was permanent, a fundamental shift in how I understood the nature of professional relationships and the limits of workplace solidarity. I was learning to forgive without forgetting, to rebuild connections without restoring the vulnerability that had made me an easy target. The promotion and raise that David offered were generous attempts to compensate for the damage that had been done, but money couldn't repair the deeper wounds that the experience had inflicted. I accepted them graciously, understanding that they represented the company's acknowledgement of wrongdoing and their desire to retain someone who had proven her resilience under pressure. But the real value of what I'd gained wasn't financial. It was the hard-won knowledge of my own capabilities and limitations, the understanding of how to protect myself without becoming paranoid or cynical. The confidence I was rebuilding was different from what I'd had before, less trusting but more authentic, based on realistic assessments rather than optimistic assumptions about human nature. I started implementing new practices in my work, documenting conversations more carefully, maintaining better records of decisions and communications, creating paper trails that would protect me if similar situations arose in the future. These weren't signs of paranoia. They were evidence of professional maturity. The practical wisdom that comes from understanding how quickly things can go wrong when you're not prepared. The advice I found myself giving to other women in the office came from a place of hard-won experience rather than theoretical knowledge. When Sarah, a new hire, asked me about navigating office politics and building professional relationships, I found myself sharing lessons that I wished someone had taught me years earlier. I told her about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries, about documenting important decisions, about trusting her instincts when something felt wrong, even if she couldn't articulate exactly why. The conversation was both difficult and liberating, a chance to transform my painful experience into something useful for someone else who was just starting her career. I wasn't trying to make her paranoid or distrustful, but I wanted her to understand that self-protection and professional success weren't mutually exclusive. That being cautious didn't mean being weak or antisocial. The frustration I'd felt at my own naivety was channeled into practical guidance that might help others avoid similar pitfalls. Teaching her these lessons helped me process my own experience, turning the betrayal I'd endured into wisdom that could benefit others. The changes in how I approached my work were subtle but significant, reflecting a new understanding of the importance of self-advocacy and professional self-preservation. I became more selective about the projects I took on, more careful about the people I collaborated with, more insistent on clear communication, and documented agreements before proceeding with important tasks. This wasn't cynicism or distrust. It was professional evolution, the natural result of understanding how quickly things could go wrong when assumptions replaced clear communication. I started speaking up more in meetings, ensuring that my contributions were clearly acknowledged and documented, refusing to let others take credit for my work or minimize my role in successful projects. The loyalty I'd once felt toward the company was replaced by a more balanced perspective, one that recognized the importance of protecting my own interests while still contributing meaningfully to organizational goals. The superacao I was experiencing wasn't just about recovering from betrayal. It was about becoming a more complete and self-aware professional who understood her own worth and wouldn't allow others to diminish it. The impact of the experience extended beyond my professional life, affecting how I approached relationships and trust in all areas of my existence. I found myself evaluating friendships differently, paying more attention to patterns of behavior rather than accepting words at face value, looking for consistency between what people said and what they actually did when it mattered. This wasn't about becoming cold or distant, but about developing better judgment and more realistic expectations about human nature and the limits of loyalty. The learning process was ongoing, a continuous refinement of my ability to read people and situations accurately, to protect myself without closing myself off from meaningful connections. I was discovering that wisdom often comes disguised as disappointment, that the most valuable lessons are frequently the most painful ones, and that strength isn't about avoiding difficult experiences but about growing from them. The woman who had emerged from this ordeal was more cautious, but also more confident, more protective but also more resilient, forever changed by betrayal but not defined by it. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that the experience had given me something unexpected and valuable, a deep understanding of my own resilience and capacity for growth. The person who had naively shared her password without a second thought was gone, but she had been replaced by someone stronger and wiser, someone who could navigate complex professional situations with greater skill and awareness. The trust I'd lost in Ryan and in the fairness of workplace systems had been painful, but it had forced me to develop my own sources of confidence and validation that no one could take away from me. The betrayal that had seemed like the end of my career had actually been the beginning of a new phase of professional development, one characterized by greater self-awareness and more sophisticated judgment. I couldn't change what had happened to me, but I had complete control over how I chose to grow from it, and that realization was perhaps the most empowering lesson of all. The scars would always be there, reminders of what I'd endured and overcome, but they were also proof of my ability to survive and thrive in the face of adversity that would have broken the person I used to be. Have you ever had to fight for your reputation when everyone had already made up their minds about you? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was actively working to undermine you? I want to hear your stories in the comments below, because this kind of workplace betrayal is more common than we want to admit, and we need to support each other through it. If this story helped you understand something about your own situation, or if it made you think differently about trust and loyalty in your professional life, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. There are so many more stories like this one, experiences that can teach us how to protect ourselves and grow stronger from the challenges we face. Your career, your reputation, your professional future, they're all worth fighting for. And I'm here to share the strategies and insights that can help you navigate the complex world of workplace, relationships, and office politics.